I'm going to talk mainly about cross-strait relations, since it has been such, and I believe remains such, a central feature in U.S. PRC relations. I'm going to speak pretty fast because I've got this 20-minute limit. I'm told the microphones turn off after that, so please bear with me on this. I've also provided to Clay a copy of a somewhat extended version, so you can look at that later. As we all know, the past 8 years in U.S.-Taiwan relations and in cross-strait relations have been very turbulent. A three-way election in Taiwan in 2000 brought to office a new party, the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party, and Chen Shui-bian. Although the DPP charter had been changed the year before to say we no longer need to declare independence, in fact, during his entire tenure, President Chen sought to underscore Taiwan's separate identity, its sovereign independent status, and Taiwanese identity of the people. The temperature of cross-strait relations went up and down during this entire period, and with it the level of concern in the United States that President Chen could wittingly or not precipitate a crisis that could either damage U.S. vital interests or even precipitate a war that would draw the United States in. There would be horrible costs, obviously, directly and indirectly. As a result, the Bush administration, which had come into office with two important points. One, it was committed to a one-China policy. President Bush, in the campaign of 2000, had said that Taiwan should not move to independence. But it was also seen as the most friendly administration, perhaps since Nixon's opening, toward Taiwan. It became increasingly hostile toward President Chen. It wasn't that the U.S. lost interest in Taiwan's security or prosperity or democratic process. It was that Washington, and specifically the president, increasingly lost patience with Chen, who seemed not only to ignore American interests, but to directly work against them at times, even when he was asked not to. Especially the first crisis, I would argue, came in August 2002, when Chen declared a vision of one country on each side, Yibian Igor, and threatened to walk down Taiwan's own path if the PRC continued, as he put it, to menace Taiwan. And this reached a crescendo in the 2003-2004 presidential campaign when he proposed a brand new constitution, which would have severed any theoretical links in the Constitution to the mainland, and when he proposed a referendum. The U.S. view of that was that the referendum he proposed was largely irrelevant to any real-world concerns, but was highly provocative to the mainland. Nonetheless, Chen persisted, and it is well known. This got to the point where President Bush, in an Oval Office meeting with Premier Wen Jiabao of the PRC, sitting at his side, chastised Chen to the press. Not something you really want to have to do. Another crescendo, already mentioned by Tom Christensen, came in 2007 when the Chen administration and President Chen personally pushed the question of Taiwan's representation and membership in the United Nations under the name Taiwan, and importantly pushed a referendum on this subject. The Bush administration, I would argue, already felt it had been badly treated. Indeed, I would not shrink from using the word deceived earlier in connection with the deactivation of the National Unification Council and guidelines, applied significant pressure on Chen to cancel the referendum and so forth. And when that didn't work, the administration went over his head to make the case to the people of Taiwan. Tom Christensen played a crucial role in making that case, both subtly but also with great clarity. In the end, neither that referendum nor a companion KMT referendum, which was put up as a defensive measure by the Kuomintang, succeeded to get the necessary votes to be valid. More than that, the KMT won not only the legislative victory in January of 2008, but as has been noted, obviously, the presidential victory with Ma Ying-jeou coming to office. Ma had, during the campaign, expressed a very different view of cross-strait relations from the Chen administration. What he wanted to do is take sovereignty over which there was an obvious clash and put it to the side and focus instead on pragmatic relationships, both bilaterally and in the world at large, that would benefit people on both sides by weaving a thicker web of relationships with the mainland, but reducing political and military tensions at the same time. As had President Hu Jintao of the PRC, Ma called for a peace accord, something that obviously is not going to happen quickly if it happens at all, but that sought to basically create a framework for long-term peace and stability that could last for several decades, I would argue, until a permanent arrangement between the two sides might be reached. Both sides agreed that economic links should come first because they were easier, because there'd already been negotiation during the China administration on some of them, but they also wanted to move in other directions. Ma called for PRC cooperation, as Tom has pointed out, in affording Taiwan greater ability to participate in the international community in what is called international space. He's made clear that he considers the Republic of China a sovereign, independent state, but rather than to make that the base of consideration for Taiwan's international participation, again, he wants to lay that issue aside and work on a pragmatic basis. For example, this year, he proposed not to join the UN or to have Taiwan's membership in the UN considered, but rather to focus on the specialized agencies of the UN, and even there, not to call for membership, but to call for meaningful participation in those agencies in whatever ways could be worked out. The near-term issue in that regard is the World Health Assembly. Now, Taiwan has participated to some extent in the activities of the World Health Organization, which is the large organization carrying out activities on healthcare. But it also wants observer status at the annual, basically 4-day meeting of the executive body of the World Health Organization, that body being called the World Health Assembly. In his inaugural address, and since, Ma has made clear that Taiwan's receiving dignity in the international community is a key to his ability and his willingness to move ahead in a robust way on bilateral cross-strait relations, and it has become clear that WHO observership is a litmus test of that proposition. He's also called for what he calls a workable foreign policy and diplomatic truce. They should stop vying across the strait for each other's diplomatic partners, and they should treat each other with respect in those organizations such as APEC or the Asian Development Bank or the World Trade Organization, where they both are represented. Beijing's reaction to all this, beyond the first economic steps, I think, as Tom Christensen pointed out earlier, have been tentative. Taiwan likes to point to the case of Paraguay, which did not move ahead with diplomatic relations, even though the new president had months ago before inauguration said he wanted to, and has claimed that this shows the PRC is cooperating. And that may be so, but I'm not sure how reliable that is over the long run. And in the area of international space per se, the case is even murkier. Beijing welcomed Ma's inaugural call for discussions between the two sides on what could be done in the area of international space. Hu Jintao and others at lower levels have said this issue can be resolved satisfactorily in such discussions. But the fact of the matter is that on the WHA case, for example, the PRC has made clear on various occasions that Taiwan is not eligible to be an observer in the WHA, nor is it eligible to be an observer in the WHO. So one has to think that probably Beijing will tolerate greater participation in the technical activities of the WHO, but that misses the big political point about this. It's hard to tell what forces are at work in the mainland on this. It's obvious there's a debate. I would say that President Hu Jintao may get it in terms of what's necessary politically within Taiwan to undergird Ma's approach so that he can move ahead in a robust way with cross-strait relations toward these larger arrangements, political framework, and so on. And I would suspect that the State Council's Taiwan Affairs Office does as well. One has to guess that the Foreign Ministry, on the other hand, which is the custodian of the requirement to block independence and sovereignty in all possible international fora, will be more cautious. And the People's Liberation Army also has expressed itself as saying it doesn't even want to look at such things as reconfiguring deployments opposite Taiwan until there's a peace accord. Well, if they don't reconfigure deployments, there won't be a peace accord. So it's a rather self-defeating position, I would argue. In any case, whoever is opposed, what they fail to grasp is that denying Ma such successes in his explicitly non-sovereignty related search for international space will be the very thing that is likely to bring back not just the DPP, but a more fundamentalist-oriented DPP. This brings us then to the issue of, well, how is the U.S. reacting to all this? Even in the period of opening to China by President Nixon, both officials and others were concerned about the fate of Taiwan. This was not unnatural. We had a long-term relationship with the island, and also we were concerned about the implications for others in the region, such as Japan, whose national interests were tied up in this. One result was that the Congress recrafted, if you will, the Taiwan Relations Act to make explicit things that, in fact, the Carter administration had hoped to keep implicit, but I don't think there was a basic change in direction in that legislation from what the administration wanted. You'll recall that Nixon never accepted the PRC's claim to sovereignty over Taiwan. He acknowledged it. He said that he would recognize the PRC during the course of the second term. The second term didn't work out so well for Mr. Nixon. He didn't do that. Even when normalization came, President Carter again repeated that he acknowledged the Chinese position on sovereignty, but he didn't accept it. Still, at that point, the PRC was not in a position to do anything, really, about forcing a resolution of Taiwan relationship. And Taiwan wasn't interested in pushing the issue. It wasn't until President Chun came into office that this issue really arose. Now, keep in mind, at that point, the U.S., Tiananmen was already 10 years in the past, and there was already a strong debate in the United States about how we should relate to China. There were those, it's a very complicated issue, obviously, but for the sake of simplicity, let me say that on one side, perhaps, were those who saw China as a tyrannical place seeking to displace the United States in East Asia, and therefore we should keep our distance. On the other side were those who said that we needed to engage with China. It was too important, it was going to be increasingly important, and despite all the flaws that we saw and all the problems that we had, we needed to engage even more. President Chun's presidency exacerbated those divisions because there was now in Taiwan a democratically elected government that essentially rejected the unity of China, and while perhaps not willing to take on the PRC through a formal declaration of independence, continued to push the envelope to underscore the island's separate identity. Why, some ask, should the United States not respect the democratic wishes of the people of Taiwan? This was consistent, after all, with our promotion of democracy within Taiwan over many years, and it accorded with a common sense view against forcing anybody to come under the regime in Beijing. Interestingly, keep in mind that at the time of Tiananmen, or after Tiananmen, when Bill Clinton campaigned, he campaigned against the earlier Bush administration, Bush the elder, for having compromised with the butchers of Beijing. And he actually sought to push Beijing through leverage of most favored nation trade treatment to change its human rights policies. He failed, and he ended up having through some ups and downs, a pretty good relationship. But among those ups and downs came the whole question of the visit of Lee Teng-hui, then the president in Taiwan, to the United States. That visit, as you all know, created a crisis in the relationship, which was then exacerbated by Beijing's launching of missiles off the northern and southern tips of Taiwan during the presidential campaign in Taiwan in March of 1996. But it was in the aftermath of that crisis that both sides worked to repair the relationship, to put it on some stable grounds, and a pair of summits was arranged. And it was during the first of those summits in Washington that a press statement was issued calling for building toward a constructive strategic partnership for the 21st century. Now the shoe was on the other foot, and when George W. Bush ran, whereas Clinton had castigated the Bush the elder, Bush now castigated Clinton for claiming that we had a strategic partnership. He didn't, but that didn't matter. This was a campaign after all. But again, I want to repeat, Bush had endorsed the one China policy. He had warned Taiwan against independence. But he also sought to paint the PRC in a very negative light. But again, ironically, there was, with the EP-3 incident where a U.S. reconnaissance plane off the southern coast of China was bumped by a Chinese Navy aircraft, and the crisis that ensued from that, Bush went out in the Rose Garden and said, we need to find a better way to deal with China. And the PRC was more than willing to try to find this. And indeed, the relationship did improve over the summer of 2001, even before 9/11. But I think one has to acknowledge that the terrorist incident of September 11th gave a significant boost to improved relations. And indeed, since that time, I would agree with both Tom and Bob that the relationship with China has been overall reasonably good. We haven't agreed on everything. Tom listed a whole bunch of problems we have. And the U.S. has particularly remained concerned about PLA modernization, which is largely directed against Taiwan at this point, just as the PRC remains concerned about U.S. arms sales to the island. But basically speaking, at the government level, and especially with the United States willing to take on Chen Shui-bian over such issues as the referendum and earlier over his claims of sovereign independent status, the relationship has gone well. When Ma Ying-jeou came to office, I think the U.S., generally speaking, approved of his new approach. But there are those, for example, some in conservative think tanks, some in Congress, elsewhere, who have sympathized with the DPP charges that Ma Ying-jeou may be going too far, too fast, and that U.S. interests are not well served. Some military specialists also worry that somehow Ma will go beyond his pledge of no unification, no independence, and no war to strike a deal with Beijing that would facilitate the PRC's presumed ambition to develop military reach farther out into the Pacific. And in the meantime, they've been concerned that Ma would not follow through on his pledges of a sufficient self-defense capability so that he would not be deterring the mainland from thinking that perhaps this might be the moment for applying military pressure to achieve a political outcome that would bring Taiwan more fully under the PRC's control. On the other side, but also concerned, are some experts and observers who have worried that too robust American support for Ma, especially in terms of arms sales, would disrupt the nascent transformation of cross-strait relations, which is an argument the PRC has been all too willing to push, and that this would run fundamentally counter to U.S. national interests. I think, and I know Tom would disagree with me about this, I think the administration's approach toward Ma in the first several months was too timid for a whole variety of reasons, some of which I think were not very serious, but they nonetheless led to something of a holding back, at least at the most senior levels. I think that at the professional level, people understood the importance of the change in Taipei, but there was still a sense of annoyance at the top of the U.S. government that Ma was trying to force his agenda onto Washington, and weren't going to let him do that. We had enough trouble from Taiwan, thank you very much. Although follow-through on the Bush arms package of 2001 through last year was lacking largely because of political problems within Taiwan, over the last year, from mid-2007 to mid-2008, in fact, it was largely on the U.S. side. First, nobody wanted to do anything particularly favorable for Chen when he was really challenging U.S. interests with his referendum and so forth. And then I think there was a sense, as I say, of annoyance with the Ma administration. But in any case, as we know, about 10 days ago, the administration did send forward a package. It was only about half of what had been considered, but I think it was a very good package. I think there were good reasons for cutting it back. On the one hand, we wanted to show support for Taiwan, continuing support, consistent with U.S. policy over a very long period of time. But on the other, there was a desire to make clear to Beijing the United States was not seeking to provoke Beijing. The United States was not seeking to get in the way of improved cross-strait relations. And I think that this handling of it was well done. A comment on the campaign. I mean, Senator McCain endorsed the arms package, but he said, number one, that submarines, which had been cut, one of the things that was cut out of the package, should be reinstated. It was only a study about feasibility, but nonetheless it should be. My own view, by the way, is that that's not a good idea. But he also raised an issue which was never in the package, and that is new batch of F-16 advanced aircraft for Taiwan. And he said we should go ahead and do that. Very sensitive issue, something that Chen Shui-bian had requested, Ma had endorsed, and Beijing had made clear was an exceptionally sensitive issue from their point of view. Senator Obama endorsed the deal, but he didn't address these issues, and I think it's fair enough to say he's not about to push these things at this point. PRC's response was to lodge strong protests, cancel some military-related meetings and so forth, But I think basically it was not an overwhelmingly disproportionate reaction, and I think that they're going to move ahead, and there's no indication that they're taking steps against Taiwan in response to this. Looking ahead, the F-16 issue still remains to be addressed. And there are a lot of ideas about whether it should go ahead, whether it shouldn't go ahead, if F-16s don't move ahead, what else could be done, and so on and so forth. And there are lots of interests that are involved here: congressional, intellectual, industrial, and policy interests, and it will be an important issue. The other issue likely to be of near-term sensitivity is, as I've said, international space. The fact is that over several administrations, the United States has supported Taiwan's meaningful participation in statehood organizations which we don't think that they're eligible to join, but the reality is that won't happen without either the PRC's acquiescence or approval. And as I say, I'm concerned that at this moment they're taking a very timid approach to this. There's going to be a heated debate in Taiwan about pushing this issue, especially in the WHA. But even in the United States, where there has been congressional concern in the past to do more, with Ma Ying-jeou now saying, look, I'm not even talking about sovereignty, I think that the pressure will grow. But it isn't clear to me what solutions the people who want to create this pressure have at their disposal. Finally, if Taiwan and the mainland ever get to the point, and I hope they will within the first term of a Ma administration, if there is at least these next 4 years, to negotiate first a comprehensive economic agreement, second a peace accord, and third an overarching political framework for peaceful development across Strait relations, I think those will also give rise to concerns within the United States. Each one will cause people to think we're going down some kind of slippery slope created by Ma's policies. My own view is that any of these agreements would need strong public support in Taiwan, and it's inconceivable to me either that Ma would want or that the political situation in Taiwan would permit negotiation of terms that would negatively affect American national security or economic interest. But my final point would be, nonetheless, this underscores the critical aspect of U.S.-Taiwan consultation. First, at normal working levels, but second, even on occasion, at higher levels. We've got to ensure that any differences are ironed out ahead of time. It's important that we be able to resolve differences between us. It's important that the United States be able to resolve any internal governmental differences. And it's important, I believe, that the U.S. government then be able to fashion an approach to the public on these questions, which allows us to be supportive instead of having been surprised or in disagreement with what Taiwan wants to do, having to object to these things in some public way. With that, I'll stop. Thanks very much.